So, Renato, does our criminal justice system even work?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. So Asha, we're back from our New Year's celebrations. We get a long-awaited opinion from Judge Merchan, and the opinion basically says that he's going to go forward with sentencing before Trump is inaugurated on January 10th. So 10 days before inauguration, but Trump can appear via Zoom, and he's going to impose unconditional discharge as the sentence, which means no sentence at all.
Yeah, this is like womp womp.
It's like, what are we doing here? Like, what was that
what
all
are
about?
we doing here? So, basically, I'm reading from New York Consolidated Laws, Penal Law, Section 65.20. The court may impose a sentence of unconditional discharge in any case where it is authorized to impose a sentence of conditional discharge if the court is of the opinion that no proper purpose would be served by imposing any condition upon the defendant's release. When a sentence of unconditional discharge is imposed for a felony, as it is here, the court shall set forth in the record the reasons for its actions. So basically, he's like, there's no point.
Yeah. I mean, he basically said, what the government wanted and I say the government, that's what in criminal justice world, we always talk about the government when we talk about the prosecution, but what Bragg's team wanted, the New York district attorney wanted, Manhattan district attorney, was that essentially he would hold off on sentencing till after Trump's term in office. And the judge rejected that because essentially he said that would mean that Trump essentially couldn't appeal. He'd have no final, no sentence, and thus he couldn't appeal for 4+ years. And he had due process rights that would violate if that happened, essentially. And Trump's team was essentially saying, look, you effectively have to just end everything right now because he's immune. And Judge Merchan rejected that on the other end. And this was sort of his way of kind of coming up with an alternative solution.
Like splitting the baby. Why not probation or something?
Well, how do you monitor? How do you have a probation officer monitoring the president of the United States? Like, you have to report in when you move or travel? Like, I don't even know how that would work. I mean, my clients who end up having to do probation and stuff, it's like I get all these questions like, well, I need to travel to Minnesota or to Paris or wherever, and my probation officer's not getting back to me. Like, well, how do I handle this problem? Can you imagine like the president being that circumstance? Like every time Air Force One takes off, they've got to like let probation know. So
well, and you forgot, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, that Trump is also allowed to appear by Zoom.
Yeah, I did mention that.
He's really busy and has got a lot of other stuff to do.
Yeah, he's got a lot of stuff to do. I mean, technically, I suppose he is busy. He's the president-elect, right? I don't know. It seems very busy.
I'm sure.
A lot of Fox News to watch.
A lot of Fox News, burgers to eat,
Yes, I don't know what to say.
I don't know.
But I think what this raises for me, I mean, Asha, I think, one thing that I've been thinking, I've had a lot of time off. So thanks to our listeners and viewers, some of whom reached out because, I was able to, I took a couple of weeks off and spent the time with my family. And then I took some time over New Year's. And I was, spent the New Year's with my wife and so on. And, I've really been contemplating and thinking about these things from trying to put myself in a longer term perspective, thinking 20 years from now. Like we now, Rudy Giuliani was testifying today, and we were all looking back and thinking about the, September 11th, 20 years ago. What about 24 years ago? 24 years in the future, what will people think of the whole movement to hold Trump accountable, all those investigations and prosecutions? And I think, it's clearly was a failure, I think, by any objective measure. And, we talked, I think, at one point in the past, like, was this worth doing? And, there's something to be gained from it. But I think this Manhattan prosecution in particular, he was convicted of felonies. That was an issue in the campaign, but it does feel like it was all for naught.
Yeah. Well, 24 years into the future, I mean, let's just hope that the Ministry of Truth hasn't completely rewritten history and people still actually know about this by then.
We've always been at war with East Asia. What are you talking about?
Exactly. The chocolate rations have always been, 15 grams or whatever. Yeah, I think, I mean, we've already kind of gone through this, but it's really hard to say because so much of this, I feel like, had to do with timing. And timing impacted so much of this, and including, and we've talked about timing in the Pancake's got opinions on this, obviously. He's paying very close attention. We've talked about the timing issues with regard to the federal cases, but there was a timing issue with the New York case as well. I mean, Bragg passed on this case for what, a year and a half?
Yeah. And really what he passed on was what I actually thought was, in many ways a stronger case that ultimately was kicked to the New York Attorney General, right? He pursued that case civilly, this Letitia James. Now, Bragg has his own reasons. He has strong feelings. I mean, I have had those discussions at times with people associated with his office regarding why he didn't think that charge was strong. But I will tell you this case, and obviously I wrote an op-ed at the time in the New York Times about this. I thought it was a very winnable case for the defense as is. I think, his team had pursued a silly strategy that was probably dictated by Trump, and they were out lawyered. But it was by no means a slam dunk. And yet, Bragg took this long to come up with a case that had been sitting out there forever. I mean, this was.
What do you mean he was out lawyered?
Oh, Trump's team? I thought Trump's team was totally out lawyered.
Trump was out lawyered.
Yeah, Trump's team. Yeah. My point is Trump's team pursued a bad strategy because they pursued a strategy that I believe really came from Trump, like go after Stormy Daniels and scorched earth, everything. And I think they were just out lawyered in the courtroom by the Manhattan DA's team. But that was not a slam dunk. So if you were going to, the fact that he passed on a case that could have had litigation risk, I think he chose another case that had litigation risk. And I also think the facts of this case didn't take another year and a half to put together because everyone knew about them from the beginning.
We had known about this. And I think the timing just matters so much because there was a lot, when you think about everything that was happening, the delay in Mar-a-Lago, because of Eileen Cannon, the delay in the Justice Department, even appointing a special counsel for Trump with January 6th. It gave so much time for him to be rehabilitated, and it really pushed out all of these convictions and trials and everything to the 11th hour.
Right.
I mean, if we were a year ahead, if this was January, 2024, I think Merchan would have more latitude.
Without a doubt. I agree with that. And really it needed to be almost a year and a half before. You really wanted this to occur before the Iowa caucuses. So that all of this occurred before any of the presidential calendar went. And I think, we've been doing this podcast long enough. I actually had the pleasure over the holidays of hearing from lots of our listeners and viewers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's actually cool. It was cool to be out and about at different places and be like, oh yeah, asking me people asking me questions about the podcast. But one thing that I will say is, you and I had a lot of discussions early on in these cases. And I remember talking about a case I had, and it ultimately went to trial this year. That was a 2020 case. It was indicted in 2020 and went to trial in 2024. And I'm like, these cases are going to get delayed or can get delayed. And we spent a lot of time talking about the calendar. And really, I think time is of the essence, and the clock matters in criminal cases. And I think it's one of many ways in which I think that perhaps this administration may not have all been the right fit for this moment.
Oh, no. And I think Biden is kind of realizing that. It sounds like, he's doing a postmortem basically and thinks that maybe Merrick Garland was not the right choice for this. I would agree with that assessment.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one thing that has been happening, Asha, in these last days is you could see the Biden administration trying to figure out how to do what they can in the last days to set some things right. Guantanamo prisoners getting released. They rejected that deal to take over U.S. Steel, trying to send some more aid to Ukraine. But no discussion of pardons, preemptive pardons, or whatever protective pardons that we talked about in the past. And, really not a lot of public facing introspection about some of these other issues as well.
No. And I think that really, I think this was a failure early on to imagine that Trump could be rehabilitated in the way that he was in the wake of January 6th, which I think we should talk about as well as another failure of our criminal accountability. I mean, I kind of think of the New York case and January 6th as bookends, right? January 6th, I know that there's a lot of debate on whether this was a meritorious case or whether it was too frivolous. I mean, I think of it as the gateway crime, the gateway election interference crime, because he was trying to suppress information that would have been relevant to voters at that time. And at that moment may have made a difference. Ironically, I pointed out, he's now going after using these libel lawsuits, going after people like Ann Seltzer for, polls that, shaped the information space. Well, that's exactly what he did. And so this was sort of, in my opinion, the gateway crime. And then, there's various other forms of election interference, including the Zelensky quid pro quo, trying to get him to announce, all of the investigation to the Bidens. And all of this culminates in the election interference that happened on January 6th. The entire disinformation campaign up to and including the actual incitement to insurrection and the attempt to block the certification of the electoral count. So I think of them as bookends, and you just have a failure on both ends.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, we have a failure to prepare the country for what's to come. We have a failure to reform our laws. We have a failure to reform even procedures. It's not like there's new regulations. We've talked at length about the special counsel regulations. It's not like there was a new set of regulations promulgated during this time period.
Those may just be rescinded.
They might be. But, we've talked in the past about friction. And if they had created a bunch of regulations about various that at least governed the operation of the Justice Department to prevent some of the abuses that there had been during the Trump administration, at least would have created some friction. They would have had to rescind those and then started acting contrary to those rescinded regulations. There was really none of that. No introspection, no looking backward. I'm trying to think of the right analogy, but it's like those movies where it's like you sort of pretend like the last chapter didn't happen. It's almost like Groundhog Day. It's like, okay, let's just sort of pretend like we didn't live the last day and just sort of rewind and like pretend like we're back in, 1988 or something like that.
I think we would be remiss, though, if we also didn't highlight the role that the Supreme Court played in all of this, right? Because you did have actors making their best effort. I think Judge Chutkan and the special counsel Jack Smith tried to move with alacrity. They tried to process these things. Even the DC Circuit, I thought, was very expeditious in dealing with these, the issue of immunity, for example. And I think the immunity case in some ways overshadows the major implication of the Trump versus Anderson case, which was the 14th Amendment case, where the court, including the liberal justices, completely punted on answering the relevant question, which was, did Trump engage in an insurrection? And instead of answering that, which, I mean, there are perhaps gray areas in the world. This doesn't seem like it was one of them. If they had answered that in the affirmative, we would not be sitting here right now about to face the inauguration of Trump. I mean, he is in fact constitutionally disqualified from being president because he engaged in an insurrection after taking an oath. However, there's no way to operationalize that, basically, legally.
You have to be careful, Asha. You're criticizing the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roberts let us know this week that is not permitted.
Yeah. So tell me more about what Chief Justice Roberts feels is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of like if you criticize the decisions in the United States Supreme Court, you are working to undermine faith in this institution. It's an interesting thing because, as lawyers, even if you're not practicing actively, right? Like I spent a lot of my time practicing law, maybe, in a way that you don't. We're both required to, obviously, as by various ethical rules, to promote respect for the judiciary. But part of that, of course, involves, this judiciary as a branch of government. And they're making decisions that are not crucial policy decisions in many ways, and also decisions. Yeah. And of course, decisions about the law that are public facing and of issues of grave public concern. And essentially, Chief Justice Roberts, instead of being introspective and saying that what the court has done is, obviously going to be subject to legitimate criticism and can be, essentially is blaming anybody who criticizes the court for their views and essentially suggesting it's illegitimate or wrongful. And I think it's interesting because I could see that potentially being used or weaponized against lawyers like ourselves who have an ethical obligation, of course, not to undermine faith in the judiciary.
Yeah, and to me, that's a very disingenuous and overbroad way of characterizing what's actually going on. There are certain kinds of criticism that can undermine the rule of law. When you believe that a judge is somehow their power is illegitimate, when you attack, their ethnic or racial background as somehow invalidating the kind of ruling that they give, advocating to not obey a decision that you disagree with, all of those undermine the rule of law. However, lawyers all the time pick apart and critique legal reasoning. And I think that's absolutely fair to do. And when legal reasoning is specious and it's not following precedent, when it's not addressing the relevant issue because of what appear to be political reasons, that's not undermining the rule of law. That's just calling a spade a spade.
Yeah, I would say something that's fairly ironic about it, I think, Asha, is that the justices themselves criticize each other's reasoning and their own decisions. So it's like Justice Sotomayor guilty of the same
right, when she's like, this is a dark day for democracy.
Right. Is she guilty of the same besmirching of the judiciary that we are? Yeah, it's very funny.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, I've read the ABA's task force for American democracy, and there are affirmative duties that they believe lawyers should be upheld to, which is don't condone violence against lawyers and judges. Don't, promote respect to adhere to legal rulings. I mean, I think those are all valid. What Chief Justice Roberts is addressing, though, are simply, I think, basic legal critiques. And as you said, I think it's just an inability to look at oneself. There's actually a great book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. And I only know the last, Carol Tavares, and the last name is Aronson, of her co-author, but it talks about exactly this, that when people go down a road, it's very, very difficult for people to admit their own mistakes. And so they double down, they rationalize, and they blame. And I really think that's where Chief Justice Roberts is right now.
Yeah. Well, certainly I think, he's probably speaking more for others in the court who have been more of the subject of criticism than him. But I thought it was interesting. It really showed where his head was at. A lot of people have hope that he could be a potential fifth vote, trying to swing the court in a different direction in certain cases. I think that's a sign that perhaps those that faith is misplaced.
Yeah, and I remember reading, I think it was a New York Times article where he was shocked that people thought the immunity decision was crazy. He thought it was going to be, people were going to be like, this is so brilliant and such a great, legal decision. And I don't know why he thought that, but I think he thought he was like, I think he thought he hit it out of the park and then was like surprised.
Yeah, and that was an era.
That was crazy cakes.
That was an area though in which he personally changed. He was pivotal to that outcome. Yes. Because I actually think, and I disagree with Justice Barrett on many points, but I thought her opinion was
more moderate in that.
I thought her opinion was where I thought the court would come out, and I thought it was much more within the mainstream of how one might think of these issues. And if he had joined that opinion, we would have had a different result that I think would not have generated the level of criticism, right? We would have, I think it would have been more what we expected from this court rather than something that was so far beyond there outside the pale.
Yeah. But here we are again, January 6th coming up, about to inaugurate someone. Again, I still feel like the Trump v. Anderson decision is also as consequential as the immunity one. And, I think it is another, failure, the other bookend to the inability to hold Trump accountable.
Oh, interesting thing is Trump's lawyer, perhaps to his own detriment, did acknowledge in that argument that January 6th and the violence on the attack on the Capitol were indefensible and wrong in that decision. And of course, the end result is putting him back in power. But I think I do think that now we're almost a 1 year anniversary of January 6th. We aren't seeing and are going to see the efforts that were done last time to try to subvert the lawful transfer of power, but it's gonna but I think that there will be a lot of introspection in the decades to come, and even if it's from afar, from other countries and other historians looking at this, I do think it is going to be a constant. These decisions regarding these investigations in particular are going to be viewed as some of the most consequential decisions in U.S. history.
Indeed.
So, Asha, we have so many other things we could talk about. I think we're going to do crime potpourri.
Crime potpourri for $500, Alex.
Exactly, because there are so many cases we haven't talked about.
And they're just random. It's like over the holidays, just a lot of random crap.
There's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, we never even talked about Luigi Mangione.
No, I feel like that happened maybe after we recorded, not last week's, but before we left for the break. I think that happened after.
Yes, and our, I'd say an associate of ours or someone we know well is his attorney. He's in I will just say, here'll be my legal analysis in the situation.
Yeah,
he is in a very, very, very difficult position because he was charged not with second-degree murder, but he was charged in state court in New York with first-degree murder. So that guy is facing the death penalty potentially or life without parole, should say, in the state of New York. So essentially you'd have to plead to get anything, plead down realistically to get anything less. And then he's facing a concurrent federal prosecution at the same time, which is almost unheard of. Federal charges usually, even subsequent to state charges like this, usually there's something called a petit policy, and typically the feds do not come in, and if they do, it's to replace state charges, not concurrently. So it's very odd to have federal charges essentially sitting in abeyance. And it really looks to me like they're trying to pressure this guy to plead. They're basically putting him in a spot where, if you don't take second-degree murder, you're going to have to win 2 trials successively, or you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison.
And New York doesn't have the death penalty, but the feds could impose the death penalty.
Feds could impose death penalty, but New York has life in prison, I think, is for first degree. And that there they have to prove that it was an act of terrorism, which is sort of interesting. This is not what I think you would ordinarily think of as a terrorism case.
Interesting. I mean, I have to say I was a little bit shocked by the reaction to that crime. And I think this is my opinion. I think that it was a reflection of how much violence has been normalized, that somehow, this idea that there could be something that justified that. And, I think just to go back to the rule of law piece, vigilante justice is not okay.
Yeah, and look, murdering people in cold blood is not something that anyone could justify. Yeah. Now, I will say that what I viewed it as, you're talking about normalizing violence. I think it's the powerlessness that a lot of people feel. We in society, we have a society in which a lot of decisions are made.
Yeah.
That it's sort of diffuse. In other words, there's not like one person responsible for it. We've spent a lot of time, Asha, talking about Trump and what he's responsible for and not responsible for. It's sometimes easier to pin things on him than when you have a decision like our healthcare system. Like, who's responsible for that? There's a whole bunch of default rules and decisions that have been made by all sorts of people, and it's really hard to fix that. We've seen that over the years, but it's also hard to hold one person responsible for how the system is, and it's easy for people to feel powerless to change that. And so I do think that part of what's going on now, we have a widening economic disparity in this country and a lot of issues where people feel like they have no power to change that.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to that, but still,
yeah, violence is
not the answer.
Yeah, don't murder people.
Don't murder people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of murdering people,
on that note,
as we move on in crime potpourri, I was horrified to wake up on New Year's Day to learn about this vehicle attack in New Orleans. One of my best friends lives in New Orleans. She was fortunately not on Bourbon Street because, like me, she's old and went to bed at 10 o'clock. Actually, I was up New Year's Eve. I actually went to a party this year. It was crazy.
Whoa.
I'll talk about that later. But
so did I.
You did?
Yes.
Oh, okay. We'll talk about that soon. But I was just on ABC News a few weeks ago talking about a vehicle attack there in a crowded Christmas market in Germany. And, it's one of these things that this has actually been happening for a really long time. I think it doesn't get the attention as much as, a big spectacle that involves guns or something does. But, since 2014, ISIS in particular has encouraged adherents to use any weapon at their disposal, including vehicles, to inflict harm in the name of their cause. And so, there is, like, going back over a decade, increasing number of these vehicle attacks all over the world. And it's very scary because it's one of those things that is very difficult to prevent, especially when you have, like, people who are radicalized as, like, as individuals, like they're not working in some kind of terrorist cell. And then we also see, of course, other groups as well using this this tactic. We saw it in Charlottesville, for example. So it's just it's a scary development to have kind of two high profile things happen so quickly right after each other.
Yeah, there's no question vehicles can be lethal weapons, and they are used particularly overseas to cause violence. But I don't think, just to be clear, that this means that this is an argument against firearm regulation or something else. In other words, there are different types of deadly attacks. I think it's fair to say that assault weapons are in a different category, but it is tragic. I will say, seeing that video of the vehicle going at super high speed and all the people running for their lives, I mean, it had to been terrifying. So just absolutely awful. And, I think it is leading to the sort of concern about lawlessness and the fear that many people have, that we've broken down so many of our sort of norms and values.
Yeah, well, it's another aspect of, the I don't know what to call them, but kind of these people at the fringes of society who are getting sucked into different kinds of radicalization, be it, incels who are radicalized into, white nationalist groups, or, Islamic fundamentalists getting radicalized by ISIS. It's a different kind of problem, different version of that same issue you were kind of talking about with the Luigi Mangione case.
Yeah. I can understand how, I can understand how people are just sort of numb to it at this point and don't know how to react. I will say, though, that the Mangione case has been unique in the sort of popular reaction. I mean, it is almost it's been shocking to see sort of how many people are, rushing to defend him. And it made me think, like, potentially you could imagine a potential defense move to try to get nullification for him, like try to just go to trial and try to go for hung juries. But I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of intense pressure put to ensure that he ultimately is pressured to plead guilty.
So what's next in crime potpourri? Pardoning of January 6th defendants, just to bring it all full circle?
Yeah, that might be the right one to end with. I mean, that is going to happen, I would say, January 20th, the day of, right, inauguration. I mean, Trump has sort of promised that. Because this is, of course, a man who opens his rallies with songs that are sung by, right, the national anthem sung by members of January 6th in prison while incarcerated.
Now, there is a spectrum of behavior for which people have been convicted for January 6th related conduct. There's trespassing, there's vandalism on one end, there's actual violence in the middle, or towards the more serious end, including against police officers, things like beating police officers with a flag, shoving them inside of a doorway that's being, crushed on them, all kinds of like really horrendous things. And then at the most extreme end, there's the seditious conspiracy charges that members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were convicted of. And these people literally had, stockpiled weapons, had a military plan to take over the Capitol and to inflict harm on members of Congress. So I'm curious, do you think Trump will have the cojones to actually pardon all of them? Or do you think even he will draw the line at least the violent conduct against law enforcement, if not violent conduct more generally?
Yeah, I think I'll pardon them all. I don't think he's going to create any
seditious conspiracy people.
Absolutely. I mean, he's going to send a message to people that if you back him and you support him, you get a free pass, that he's going to support you. He views it's very transactional, Jim. And I think if you support him, he supports you. I mean, this is the man who wouldn't condemn the Proud Boys on a live TV debate during the presidential debates of 2020. So I think no question he's going to pardon them all. And it's going to send a message that essentially, if you back Trump, you're not going to get punished. And I think it's the sort of thing he'll just do it with a broad stroke and say it was, quote, unfair, unquote. It'll get sane washed by mainstream media who will say, oh, he's been saying this for a long time and it's a blanket pardon or something along those lines. And they won't it might get a story or two, but it'll be a blip, and then everyone will move to the next headline. But I think it's the sort of thing that sends a message. It sends a message that if you engage in violence on his behalf, he's going to support you. That would be my strong inclination of what he's going to do. I'd be shocked. I think it'll take more cojones for him at this point to stand up against his own supporters. I don't see him doing it.
Really? I don't know, because right now there's the showcase showdown happening between the tech oligarchs and the MAGA, whatever, racists.
Yeah. Do you think those tech guys really care about the January 6th issue? I mean, what do they care?
No, they don't. I'm just I don't know where I'm going with this.
It's about money.
I would like to think that maybe there's somebody in his ear that would say, don't pardon the seditious conspiracy people who are actually trying to overthrow the government.
Okay. Well, I've done pretty well predicting that Trump's going to just do whatever the hell he wants. So I'm gonna stick with.
You're going to keep your money on that?
I've done pretty well betting on black here. So I'm just going to continue to bet on black and watch the roulette wheel continue to come that way. It is what it is. I think it's unfortunate. Unfortunate is not even the right word. I mean, I think it's disgraceful that people who planned an armed attack on the Capitol and hurt people, and in some cases
wanted to hang the vice president.
Right. And in some cases actually cause grievous harm to law enforcement officers, are going to get off scot-free. But that is what Trump has promised. I don't think that Trump has ever drew a distinction between some January 6thers and others. He's always sort of given that the back of his hand. So I'm going to expect him to do what he says he's going to do. We'll see.
Stand back and stand by.
Indeed.
Well, that was a pretty depressing pod for the beginning of January. So maybe before we go, we should talk about happier stuff.
I suppose. I was happy to welcome in 2025 because 2024 was not my favorite year ever. But I will. Well, we had such a great election. It was a fantastic result. But in all seriousness, it was good for me to spend time with my wife. We were in Charleston. I was there for Renaissance weekend. I've done, which is like an event that they have, their kind of an ideas festival thing. I've done that a few times before, but I thought it would be a nice time for me to get away even more with my wife. I worked so hard this last year, so many hours.
That you were working really hard.
It was insane. That, probably 3,000 plus hours this year. So it was this past year. So it was nice to spend time with every moment I could with my wife. And so it was nice to get away. But it was also great to talk to all sorts of people. That's where I met all sorts of people from different walks of life, and a lot of people who listen to our podcast, and, everyone from moral philosophers to, tech bros, like you were saying, and others. So it's great.
Cool. Yeah, 2024 was a weird year for me too. I think a lot of personal transitions, but I feel like it kind of election aside, on a personal note, it ended on an upswing. I think going
election aside, it's like, ignore the body, but everything else is great.
In the garage.
Yeah, exactly. Everything else is great.
Everything else is great. No, it's, I do think that frame of mind matters. And I think that we need to be clear-eyed and ready to respond to everything. But at the same time, I think it's important to not get despondent. And so I've been meditating. I made a vision board for 2025. Wow. I even went to a party on New Year's Eve, which I haven't done in years, and danced the night away.
That's awesome. I got my wife to stay up till midnight. I'll tell you, that's very hard. She's like, 9 o'clock. She's one of those people who's like bed very early, but I
was up till 3 a.m.
Whoa. Well, you're a party girl. Always have been, right?
I have been kind of a party girl, but it took me like 2 days to recover from that.
Wow. So there's champagne and fries.
Well, yes. So what are your resolutions for the coming year? Anything? Do you do resolutions?
No, but there are always things that I'm trying to improve. I mean, I'm definitely, I definitely, my weight increased. I think we've talked about it before. I used to be super mega obese, so I always am watching my weight, and it went up. Having a cruise full of all you can eat food, followed by Renaissance weekend with all you can eat buffets. So I am definitely on a fitness kick right now. And I'm really trying to. I've been doing a lot of stuff with my law practice, trying to establish that. I feel a lot of responsibility for my associates and stuff that I brought over to my new firm. So that's been really my focus for the last few months.
Yeah. I'm not doing resolutions. I'm doing intentions.
Whoa. What's the difference?
Resolutions are like external, like goals. And intentions, I think, are more inward focused. Like where you're going to put your time and attention and energy, and what frame of mind you're going to bring to it, and the kind of skills that you're going to need to be able to maintain that intention.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's deep.
So what are your intentions, if we have time in this podcast to get to your intention? I'm super interested.
I have them written down, but some, I mean, they're probably too much to go into, but some deal with health and fitness.
That's great.
One of them deals with getting to projects that I have kind of been putting off, and kind of addressing like whatever resistance I'm facing on that. Like, I want to do a book project. I have been unable to like sit down and focus, even though I kind of have it in my mind on what I want to do. So I need to kind of be intentional about that. And then the other is to, be more, I think, self-loving, and like kind of checking in more with how I feel in different personal relationships. Because sometimes I'm too outward focused, and I'm not really taking care of what I want and need.
Wow. Oh, that's really important. It's important not to lose yourself in relationships. So as a friend, I think that's a good thing. I'm really glad to hear that. And I feel you with the book thing. I've somebody who loves reading books and have had books that I wanted to write. I've had publishers reach out to me, but having the discipline and the amount of time to just focus on that is hard when both of us, I think, are pulled in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. But 2025 will be different.
Or so we say.
Happy New Year, Renato.
Happy New Year, Asha.